Hello, my fellow survivors of the tiny minority who are still able to separate art from the artist and just enjoy quality music that they grew up with for many years before they knew anything about the singer. Welcome back to Horror Convos, a casual, relaxing, and occasionally funny podcast where we choose one topic per episode and discuss horror media related to it, as well as my own personal history, thoughts, and opinions with that topic. We then segue into examples of media that portray the subject effectively. I often have guests join in the conversation, and we hold regular polls for you to decide what topic is covered on our Patreon exclusive For the Fans episodes. If you're not a fan of ads inserting ever more subliminal messages into your everyday routine, you can listen to the podcast ad-free along with other exclusive content on Patreon.
Must kill Lincoln.
Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to like, subscribe, and chant the words notification bell 3 times in a dark room so the demons of Selzar ensure that you never miss when our newest content is uploaded. Today is part 2 of what was originally planned to be a single podcast but was cut for time constraints due to previous technical difficulties with a prior episode. Again, due to that complication, this second half will be a shorter episode than usual. I apologize for that. You can treat both parts of this topic as basically one podcast split into 2. We spent last episode discussing the history, psychology, and my personal experiences with the horror of mirrors before diving into examples of media that I consider to be high-quality exercises in making mirrors themselves scary. If you haven't listened to that podcast yet, what the fuck are you doing here? Can you not count? You literally just heard me say the number 2. Get the fuck out of my sight. That's right, I'm looking at you right now. We're doing this fucking live. Get your face off of this screen, go listen to the last episode, and then come back here and act like you've got enough basic comprehension of mathematics that I stop confusing you with Billy Madison.
Shut up!
And now that you're back up to speed on the correct episode order, this podcast will focus on who is probably everyone's favorite, or at least best known icon within the horror subgenre of mirrors. Her first name may sound biblical, but she is not commonly known for being anything but quite contrary to an angel unless it's an angel of death. She does not like being catcalled, but will sure as hell not likely stand you up on a date if you want it bad enough. Legend says that speaking her name aloud and into a mirror anywhere from 1 to 3 to 100 times will summon her spirit with a reflection that would make the very glass she appears in cry out, "Oh, hell no!" Before shattering into 7 years' worth of bad luck, heralding a fate that may very well be worse than death. I'm such a nutless pants shitter that even I can only bear to say it once, weighing in at a degraded undead mass of 142 pounds, with a height of nearly 6 feet tall. I seriously don't want to fucking say it, but I know it's my job. I don't think I can drag this out any longer, folks. Tell my children I love them, and my venomous bitch of an ex-wife can have the damn mahogany coffee tables. Introducing the mirror mistress of the monstrous matriarchy, the crimson crone of catoptromancy, the red wet dream of your worst nightmares. Dear sweet God, have mercy on my soul. Bloody Mary! One day, as she looked in a mirror, she could stand her ugliness no more. In a fit of rage and insanity, she put a curse upon the mirror and shattered it, fatally cutting herself in the process. From that time on, if anyone stares straight into a mirror, provided the room is completely dark, concentrates and says, Mary Worth, come to me, she will appear. She will come as a distant, shadowy figure at first that gets more distinct as she comes closer. If you continue to watch and look upon her completely, she will shatter the mirror, trying to mar your face as hers was. So, as I mentioned in the last episode, this character and the stories surrounding her are arguably almost as old, if not just as old, as the classic legends of the boogeyman. I would say she is the quintessential boogie woman in multiple respects. Like the boogeyman, for instance, she's known by many different names, backstories, and folklore spanning several cultures around the globe. Bloody Mary, Hell Mary, Mary Jane, Mary Lou, Mary Weather, Mary Wales, Mary Worth. The whole concept of a female apparition or entity in our reflection has a wide range of portrayals, including legends that don't include a mirror or even necessarily a summoning ritual, but share other similar details and themes regarding the character herself.
Same story, different versions, and all are true.
That's one major reason why I think this type of story appeals to us psychologically in almost any genre, because centuries later, after what I'm sure have been an estimated dozens of attempts at digging through the history behind every iteration on the concept, we still don't have the documentation to confirm its exact point of origin, and that makes sense when you consider a couple of things. A, and this will vary, of course, depending on where you live. I'm speaking only from my own research prepping for this episode, but from what I found, Mary is historically an extremely common name in certain parts of the world, particularly the Western world. According to a statistical ranking on socialsecurityadministration.gov of the most popular names given in the United States over the past 100 years until 2022, it was recorded as the most popular name in America from 1923 to 1946. BehindTheName.com and VeryWellFamily.com date the popularity of the name Mary as far back as 1880, and this isn't even accounting for the frequency of other variants used in other cultures and languages, like Maria or Marie. So, of all the names to give such a popular ghost, this one definitely wouldn't make it easy to narrow down. Imagine if Hercules had to deal with this, right?
This might be a different Hercules. Yeah, I mean, Hercules is a very popular name nowadays. Remember, like a few years ago, every other boy was named Jason, and the girls were all named Brittany.
B, like with most urban legends, Bloody Mary's been retold so many times in so many different parts of the world and so distorted via the inevitable inconsistencies that come with word of mouth by this point, that it's possible some folklores may be connected to or directly inspired from an older version of the story or idea, but it was so long ago that the people within that culture don't know of a connection anymore, or just don't associate their version of the legend with Mary's name. If you're interested in diving more deeply into the history, just search it on YouTube or Google, and you'll have no shortage of in-depth, thoroughly researched, sometimes entertainingly constructed, full-blown documentaries to choose from. It's certainly a huge topic, even in the current year, or as far as, the big names in horror. I looked at a few in preparation for this episode, and I'll play you a few minutes of audio from one that I thought was concise enough to cover all the best-known candidates for speculating on Bloody Mary's origins. And this comes from the YouTube channel Mythology Unleashed. They detail history on a wide variety of folklore. Check them out if you'd like to see more, and I hope you enjoy this little tidbit.
Since at least the 2nd century CE, scare-seekers and the superstitious have been dabbling in catoptromancy for a number of divinatory reasons. In ancient Greece, sick people would visit temples where they would look into a mirror. If a healthy-looking apparition stared back at them, they were expected to recover. But if the apparition was ugly or decrepit, their days were numbered. In Edwardian Britain, young women would look for visions of their future husbands by walking up a flight of stairs backward, holding a candle and a handheld mirror in a darkened house. As they gazed into the mirror, they were said to be able to catch a view of their future husband's face. There was, however, a chance that they would see a skull instead, rumored to be the face of the Grim Reaper, indicating that they were going to die before they would have the chance to get married. These examples may be the roots of the ritual of Bloody Mary. But then that begs the question, just where did Bloody Mary herself come from? While there is no confirmation on the identity of Bloody Mary, a number of possible contenders have been theorized. Some believe that the Bloody Mary legend is directly tied to Queen Mary I of England, who would in time earn the nickname of Bloody Mary. born on February 18, 1516, to King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. One of Mary's most urgent priorities as queen was returning England to the Catholic Church. She had succeeded in reversing many of her father and half-brother's anti-Catholic policies, but in 1555 she went one step further by reviving a law called Heretico Comburendo, which punished heretics by burning them at the stake. Until the time of Mary's death, nearly 300 Protestants were burned alive at her command. After Mary had died during an influenza epidemic, her legacy of killing was well established, as was her nickname, Bloody Mary. Another possibility for Bloody Mary's identity is Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman accused of vampirism and charged with killing at least 80 girls and young women between 1590 and 1610. It is said that she subjected them to sickening torture, sewing their lips shut, beating them with clubs, and burning them with hot irons. What's worse is she even allegedly bathed in their blood in order to maintain her youthful appearance. Furthermore, one witness claimed during Bathory's trial that they had seen a diary in which Bathory recorded her victims. There were not 80 names on the list, but 650. Some of her defenders argue that the charges against her were fabricated because the king owed her late husband debts. Regardless, her bloodthirsty reputation has cemented Bathory as a fair candidate to be Bloody Mary. Yet another potential candidate is Mary Worth, a mysterious woman whose own history is shrouded in mist, to the point that some question whether or not she truly existed at all. According to one telling, Worth was a witch of the colonial era of America, who allegedly put children under her spell, kidnapped them, murdered them, and then used their blood to stay youthful. And when people in her town found out, they reportedly tied her to a stake and burned her alive. It is said Mary Worth screamed that, if they dared say her name in the mirror, she would haunt them. In another telling, Worth was a local of Wadsworth, Illinois, who was part of the Reverse Underground Railroad, luring in people who had escaped from bondage under false pretenses and sending them back down south for profit. Worth was also said to torture and kill a select few as part of her witchy rituals. Eventually, the local townspeople discovered her evil acts and had her lynched.
Man, weren't those all just some fine young ladies, huh?
So, will it be Bachelorette number 1, Bachelorette number 2, or Bachelorette number 3?
So now let's go over a few of the Bloody Mary variants that have done God's work traumatizing the innocence out of children in other parts of the world. There's just something so pure about the first time they wake up crying from a night terror. Oh, the memories I would make if I have kids of my own one day.
Oh my gosh! A floating shopping list! Ah!
Now, first up on our globe-trotting tour of Bloody Mary's pop cultural family tree is Mexico, home to the filicidal maiden of the watery grave, La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. Terror to many, first Latina crush to some. Some people are into that shit. We don't kink shame here. Just know going in that she's not the best candidate for family men. Much like Mary, this story has become so widely known over centuries that it seeped its way into multiple different countries' media over time, including multiple film adaptations marketed in America, most recently, I think, 2019's spin-off in the Conjuring franchise.
God, when is that gonna end?
It's so popular that even in the U.S. states that border on Mexico, Such as Southern California, there are kids who will not go near riverbanks, lakes, or other bodies of water alone, especially not after dark. One thing these stories have in common right off the bat is that, again, there's no definitive proof I've found as to which version is most historically accurate, so I'm just going to go by whatever narrative is most recognized, and like I said, feel free to hunt for more details yourself if one or more of these legends strike your fancy. Now, there are countless videos and probably other horror podcasts that have already recounted these stories, so I'm not even going to try to top them all. I want you to have the best experience you can with this podcast, and part of that intended experience is being able to listen to other people besides me talk, especially when someone may have a more informed take on a particular topic than I do, or just offers some entertaining and interesting opinions, which I find value in sharing. Like I always say, this is more than a podcast. It is a dialogue between horror lovers, especially you. As always, I encourage you to like, subscribe, and generally support every one of these sources that I reference. Subscribe to all of them if you like. But of course, that choice is ultimately up to you, depending on your personal preferences. All the same, I'd expect anyone who referenced a piece of my work to have the common courtesy to do the same for me. And if you don't, I will find you.
Before this night's over, I will kill you. But before I kill you, I will make you suffer pain so unimaginable, you will wiggle and beg and pray for the gift of death. Eventually, I will give you that gift. But when you wake up in hell, you won't find peace, because I'll be there waiting for you again.
So, to tell us more about La Llorona, I will open the floor to Dr. Emily Zarka from the PBS digital studio series Monstrum. If you'd like to hear more of her work as well as a variety of other content, check out the YouTube channel Storied. Take it away, Doc.
La Llorona, the Weeping Woman of Mexico. Varieties of this monster exist in cultures around the globe, and we see in La Llorona a few common characteristics. She is a ghost and a mother, and is, well, always weeping because she drowned her children. Culturally, the story of La Llorona is used to scare children into obedience, but a ghostly woman in white sulking in the darkness is hardly original. To understand why La Llorona looks and acts the way she does, and why she is such a cultural icon in Mexico, we must look to history, back to a time of Spanish conquistadors and Aztec goddesses. La Llorona has some truly unique elements to her story, and she represents the social history of Greater Mexico. The stories of La Llorona fall into two main groups: Encuentro, the first-person accounts of people who have seen the ghost, and Historia, tales of how La Llorona went from regular woman to murderer and ghost. Although her Historia changes based on where the story is told and who tells it, the general tale is this: once there was a beautiful indigenous Mexican woman who fell in love with a man of a higher social status. For a while, they lived happily together, raising their children. Then one day, the man abandons her. Sometimes he plans to marry a woman of his own status. Other times he threatens to take the children. Rage and despair drive the woman to drown her children. And then she meets her own demise. God curses her to wander as a ghost, searching for her lost children so she can get into heaven. She cries out for them in the night, and in her desperation, may kidnap other children, mistaking them for her own. Most scholars agree that at least some of the foundational parts of the story date well before the 16th century, when the Spanish began their conquests in the Western Hemisphere. Take this goddess, for instance. Known as the first woman in the world to the Aztecs, she appears dressed in white and carrying a cradle, walking through the streets at night weeping, disappearing into a lake or river. Aztecs placed high value on women who died in childbirth. They became cultural heroes, and they were the only women who could achieve afterlife, like the male warriors. But their afterlife wasn't so great. They became night ghosts, waiting at the crossroads to curse children and tempt men. Yeah, that's a La Llorona. In 16th century Mexico, two key things happened that shaped La Llorona into the monster we recognize today. First, the Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, arrived, and with them came the introduction of several influences. The first was European mythology. An influential mythological figure was Medea, the Greek enchantress who murders her own children after being abandoned by her husband. Then there was Christianity, which was injected into the myth, adding God and heaven to the story. The other major influence was a woman known as La Malinche. During the conquest, as part of a peace agreement, Cortez and his men were given 20 female slaves, including Malinche, a woman born to a noble family. Malinche made the most of a bad situation, immediately becoming invaluable to the Spanish as a translator and diplomat. She served as Cortez's personal translator and ultimately became his mistress and mother of his son. Malinche's son was legitimized, but taken away from her and sent to Spain for education. Most historians agree that without Malinche's presence, the expedition and conquest of Tenochtitlan would never have happened, which obviously makes her a controversial figure. She has been portrayed as everything from a traitor to a victim, and is referred to by many names. Only since the 20th century has Malinche been accepted more widely as something other than a traitor, and that's around the same time La Llorona was recognized as a symbol of resistance to traditional patriarchy by Chicana authors and others. The parallels between La Llorona and Malinche are undeniable, and they contributed to one another's folklore. Both were abandoned by a wealthy Spaniard, and were indigenous mothers whose children were taken from them. In these stories, the children, the relationships between indigenous women and European men, and the introduction of a new religion represent the conflict between indigenous cultures and incoming Europeans. Since then, the story of La Llorona has traveled far and wide, and she is known by many names. As her myth has spread, so has her reach. In addition to bodies of water, she is now said to haunt more urban spaces like highways and railroads. She's been known to appear in the back of your car if you fail to give her a ride, making for what is possibly the worst backseat driver I've ever heard of. And with the myth becoming more visible in popular culture, I'm sure more people will hear about her for the first time. La Llorona's story is open to a variety of interpretations. It can be a warning to women to choose their lovers cautiously, or about the difficulty of being a single mother. It can be seen as a criticism of female sexuality, or as a metaphor for the grief over generations of indigenous Mexicans killed during the Spanish conquest. Personally, I'm inclined to side with those who read La Llorona as a representation of the painful merging of Spanish and indigenous cultures. She represents the religious and social history of Greater Mexico, and continues to do so today.
Next up, we'll visit the country that very often kicks our Western asses at horror with all kinds of demented shit, Japan.
Of course!
So this one does involve a summoning ritual and in some versions a mirror, but as with more than a couple Asian urban legends, this one usually takes place in a bathroom. It does not, however, refer to the titular character as anything that could be translated to some variant of Mary. Nonetheless, there are those in Japan who consider her their country's equivalent to Bloody Mary. She is similarly the subject of several adaptations. Hanako-san. I couldn't find a video on this one that I really liked, so I'll try to summarize it for you myself, that there are numerous movies and short films based on this character, but they're better when you actually watch them, not just listen to, someone talk about them. There is a quality Hanako-san animated short that I'd recommend from the YouTube channel Merrily Horror Animations. I'm a big fan in general of talented YouTube animators. I've watched I don't know how many, probably since the late 2000s when the website was still in its infancy, and my younger sister dragged me to watch every single animation she could find based on the Warrior Cats book series that she still follows to this day, because she's like a Warriors historian at this point. To her credit, though, if you're into fantasy, adventure, talking animals, especially cats, and brutal animal-on-animal violence, like Watership Down levels of violent, I would recommend Warriors. I never got as into it personally. I tried once or twice. It just wasn't for me. It's a very long and, in my opinion, kind of convoluted franchise to get into at this point. There are several sagas and sets of characters to follow now. It's not an ongoing series like in traditional comics or manga, but you might like it. Now, a number of individuals insist that this urban legend is at least loosely inspired from true accounts dating back to sometime in the 1940s, if the claims are to be believed. Hanako-san was a young girl who lived during the height of World War II. Some versions of the story claim she was an orphan relentlessly bullied by her classmates at school because her parents were jailed and executed for the crime of protesting the war. Ostracized and lonely, Hanako-san spent all her free time in the girls' restroom on the 3rd floor, crying, hiding from her bullies in the 3rd stall furthest from the door, or playing to pass the time by herself until it was safe to come out. Tragically, this restroom would become her tomb when the school was bombed in an air raid, leaving no survivors. Other accounts say she was murdered by a faculty member or her own parents in that restroom stall. Others claim she committed suicide out of grief over her parents and or bullying. Following the school's reconstruction, word began to spread of what sounded like a little girl's voice or crying coming from the 3rd stall of the 3rd floor restroom. Some stories paint her as a vengeful spirit, or yokai, as the Japanese call it, who will kill anyone that disturbs her stall by grabbing them the moment the door opens and dragging them straight down the toilet to hell. Or you may be eaten by a 3-headed lizard demon using Hanako-san's form and voice as a less threatening disguise to lure in unwary victims. In some stories, the entity disguising itself as her is actually the devil himself. Some say she's a docile ghost who only wants a friend to play with her and alleviate her eternity of isolation, as her soul remains trapped in that same restroom between life and death. Others say it depends on her mood, or whether you disrespect her like her bullies did, such as by dropping a deuce in her stall's toilet. She might also kill you if she thinks you resemble her killer. Some claim she can appear in any 3rd floor public bathroom, at least in Japan, if summoned there. And depending on the story, the ritual to summon her must be performed in the bathroom stall itself, though she may also appear in the mirror if one is present in that room. The ritual is very similar to that of Bloody Marys, and also similarly often used by children in Japan as a game or rite of passage to prove one's bravery. I mean, that's a common thing in America, too. Plenty of kids, I imagine, dared each other to do that at sleepovers. Most versions of the legend instruct that you must knock on the 3rd stall, or just the last stall in the row closest to the back wall, however many there are in that particular bathroom. You ask, "Hanako-san, are you there?" 3 times, and after 3 sets of that same knock followed by the question, either her child voice or a demonic-sounding one will answer, "I am here." If this story sounds familiar to you Brits, it's most likely due to the similar backstory of Moaning Myrtle from Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Why does the number 3 hold any significance to Hanako-san? I don't know. Maybe it's a Japanese cultural thing. I have read that 3 is considered in Japan to be a lucky number, much like our lucky number 7. And though I think 7 is a lucky number there as well, albeit maybe for different reasons. If you know something about that, feel free to educate me in the comments. I know the number 4 is frowned upon there, much like how we're superstitious about the number 13. Apparently, in the Japanese language, the character for the number 4 sounds phonetically almost identical to the character that translates for death, but I don't know how the number 3 would specifically connect to Hanako-san. Maybe she just has the same problem Mustafa did.
I can't stand to be asked the same question 3 times. It just irritates me.
So lastly, let's talk about the psychology behind Bloody Mary as a concept. Now, I fully acknowledge and recognize that there may be some aspects of her cultural influence that I fundamentally can never fully grasp. It's entirely plausible that my experiences as a male have colored my perception of this story and the mentality behind it, particularly in regards to historically socialized societal gender roles that I might not comprehend, because there are certain things girls go through in life and factors surrounding how girls are influenced to view themselves by society that boys generally don't go through in the same ways. Just like there are things boys go through and societal expectations conditioned into them that girls can't fully understand. I've read and listened to a variety of perspectives and analyses on the Bloody Mary folklore, and there are valuable perspectives to be gained from analysts of every background, sex, and demographic, but in my anecdotal experience, the majority of analyses I've personally seen have been from a female point of view. And while I've never done an exact head count or watched a marathon of every Bloody Mary adaptation in film or other mediums, I would estimate that the majority of characters tormented by Mary in these adaptations are female as well. But because, again, of all the horror icons throughout history, Bloody Mary has been one of the few consistently popular, so hugely influential female ones. That there are others, obviously, across different cultures. Japanese horror alone has practically become a meme at this point with how chock full it is of infrequently similar, at worst pretty much interchangeable Asian ghost women sporting pale skin, white clothes, and faces obscured by long black hair.
Racist.
Every culture's folklore has at least some overlap in how they explore and visualize similar tropes. That's just human nature. The majority of us have more in common than we might think regarding how our experiences, advancements, and environmental influences have shaped our ancient campfire stories and generally well-intended cautionary tales that have evolved into modern urban legends. On a certain level, I've talked about this before, they're like in the last episode, it all goes back to those primal elements we've discussed about the human condition. I would say that, culturally speaking, Bloody Mary as an icon probably best serves to reflect the relationship between the female experience through and the male lens through which it has often historically been characterized. I suppose maybe you could consider that a form of mansplaining, depending on who's telling the story and what version of the character is being used. I discussed my thoughts in the last episode on how this character relates to the horror of mirrors and the psychology behind why we fear what's in our reflections to begin with. But from a standpoint of sex, a very common point I hear, which I agree with, is that, as with many female horror icons, Bloody Mary's inconsistent backstories, visual descriptions, and portrayals across different stories, from a malevolent demon to a wish-granting mirror fairy,
I ain't no fairy!
they can all be viewed as commentaries, perhaps even unconsciously influenced commentaries, on the trials of womanhood, and on a deeper level, really the psychology of femininity in itself. Stephen King set the bar for that in the 20th century with his debut novel Carrie, which, if we recall, the one who first championed that story and insisted that he publish it as a novel was his wife Tabitha, who fished it out of the trash, and if I recall correctly, was the first person besides King himself to read the whole thing, the draft of it that Stephen had written out at that point. And depending on who you ask and what you believe, it's possible Stephen may owe some amount of that story's commentary and how Carrie White is written to a little influence from Tabitha herself. I'm sure he's talked about all of this countless times. Which interviews specifically, I don't know off the top of my head. I've heard him talk on so many interviews and conventions, I can't remember which ones he goes in depth on about the exact origins of how much exactly of Carrie came from him and his experiences versus any notes at all on certain parts or ideas in the story that may have come from his wife. But even if I'm totally wrong about that, I really do think that the man he was after he got with Tabitha and got married is the man that he needed to be in order to write that story into the final result that we got. Not just because of how Tabitha encouraged him, but because of how being married or just it being in a serious relationship in itself may have had some impact on King's mentality as he developed what would become Carrie White as we know her today. Not to say that he didn't put in the work and the talent, of course, credit where credit's due, but even if he had decided to go through with the story on his own, I don't think it would have been quite the same book that we got on, in this case, a tragic example of the baptism by fire that female puberty biologically, psychologically, and societally is, especially when bullying is involved. It's worse than ever in some ways today, chiefly thanks to the unadulterated freedom and anonymity that came with the internet. Children in general historically are often cruel, if we're being honest. Not that adults aren't too, obviously, from time to time, but cruelty comes so easily to our innate selfishness and self-centeredness at a young age that I do think it's something we need to be taught to reject. It doesn't just magically happen on its own. No, like we just spontaneously learn the value of empathy and become nicer, or with no incentive to do so. It's just part of growing up in general, maturing. But as someone who was raised by women in a family with all sisters and no brothers until my stepbrother came along after I graduated high school, I can say from personal experience, with no sexism intended, that on average, women and girls can be so much more diabolical to others and to themselves in ways that not many boys could even imagine at that age. Like, my mom and sisters never did that to me. Don't worry, my family and I love each other very much. They're some of my favorite people in the world, but I have seen for myself that boys and men often bully people more physically. Girls and women can fucking destroy you emotionally and psychologically. Like, there is truth to how the plastics are portrayed in Mean Girls and the shit that Winona Ryder went through in Heathers. Males can do that to an extent, of course. Females, more often than not, are the fucking pros, dude. Like, all our female fans in the comments, please tell me if I'm wrong.
Hell is a teenage girl.
Stephen has talked about how one of his biggest inspirations for Carrie came from his observations of teenage girls at his high school who bullied one girl so badly that she sadly ended up taking her own life. And we so often reference Carrie as symbolism for the horrors of menstruation, repressed sexuality, female shaming in general, lack of guidance, and a healthy example to look to in one's own mother, that there's so much in that story which countless girls and women around the world can relate to that I think you could at least potentially trace back in some respects to Bloody Mary. Carrie may not have had her powers tied to a mirror, but for everyone who remembers that timeless prom scene with Sissy Spacek's 1,000-yard death glare covered in blood, ask yourself this: as far back as you can think regarding female horror icons in fiction, who is the first character long before Carrie that the image of a creepy-eyed woman drenched in blood instinctively makes you think of? What do we tie that core profile back to historically, if not Bloody Mary? It's in her name, whether it's pig's blood, human blood, menstrual blood.
Yo, that's my period, you dumb bitch! That's my period!
King wrote a powerful character in Carrie White, but he most certainly did not invent or otherwise pioneer that image. He basically just reintroduced it to a new generation through a new take on some familiar concepts. And he said himself several times that he doesn't create his ideas, he only finds them. And, he arguably essentially reinvented what Bloody Mary originally represented, and still does to so many, but with his own modern spin on it through the lens of high school, with background themes of religious extremism and general teenage cliques. Hypothetically, if people had never seen or read Carrie before and they looked at that iconic prom image, I can confidently guess that Bloody Mary would have been the first thing many people thought of. Now, granted, there are definitely versions of these archetypes that go beyond womanhood. You can find examples in every demographic that utilize similar tropes. Clive Barker technically beat Stephen King to it, even though his works didn't gain a wider audience until the 1980s with Hellraiser, but 1992's Candyman overtly ripped off Bloody Mary and successfully transformed Clive Barker's concept into its own unique entity that functioned as a whole new horror icon for the black community. That's the entire foundation of Daniel Robitaille and later other characters who would embody the spirit of Candyman throughout every subsequent generation of black people facing adversity in America. The character of Candyman as we know it outside Barker's original story is not a singular one person. He's not a Freddy Krueger, Jason, Chucky, Michael, or even Pinhead. He is an idea, and not just in a narrative sense. He himself is a story brought to life through sheer will, who can eternally survive and thrive only through the continued spread of his name and some version of his legend. He can only truly die if he is forgotten, but every time the threat of being forgotten creeps up on him, somehow he always finds a way to make at least one person the next protagonist in his story. He's a cautionary tale about the incredible but potentially dangerous power of stories that human beings have always used to connect to one another. When that power gets away from us, grows beyond our control, becomes tainted, or inspires real people to choose to commit heinous acts. I apologize for the thunder in the background, just, perfect timing with the weather. But it's like that gang leader using Candyman's name who terrorizes Cabrini Green and attacks Helen Lyle once she starts snooping around. That's just one example of how the story manifests over centuries is through the human connection of storytelling. It's specifically these kinds of stories reflecting and representing real-world horrors that, as Helen points out in both this film and a recording of her in the 2021 sequel, they act as fuel on the fire of this modern folklore.
An entire community starts attributing the daily horrors of their lives to a mythical figure.
Yeah, that's scary. A community of marginalized people still feeling less than due to how society has treated them use the practice, and I guess you could consider it the ritual of storytelling, as a means to cope with the current reality they live in, and in doing so, in context of this fiction, they unintentionally give life to the story of Black people and the generational trauma of injustices they've suffered in the United States alone. Their stories give physical form and will, consciousness, to this dark reflection that manifests as an amalgamation of their own unresolved fears, anger, pain, insecurities, and individual as well as historical demons. In both a thematic and literal sense, Candyman is them, and they are all him.
Candyman ain't a he. Candyman's the whole damn hive.
And while the ritual to summon him is indisputably drawn from Bloody Mary, the similarities mostly end there. You could argue that he takes some influence from other horror icons too, like Dracula, but everything else about his concept really takes on its own identity within the film's universe and in the franchise's pop cultural impact. There were certainly minority characters and at least a couple minority killers in the horror genre before 1992, but there were no Black horror icons at the level of Candyman. And in terms of influence, before Tony Todd stepped into that role that, rightfully launched him to superstardom after he'd gained some traction in 1990's Night of the Living Dead remake, which we will talk about in a future episode. So while this character's existence is, let's say, 5% owed to Bloody Mary, 95% of it is owed to the real horrors that exist in Black history and how director and screenwriter Bernard Rose approached tackling that kind of story. And that is it for this part 2 on the discussion of Horror of Mirrors. Join us next time when we dive into the proverbial womb of iconic mothers in horror. If you let your children listen to this podcast and they walk away from the next episode being absolutely fucking terrified of you, well, that probably says more about you than it does my capacity to poison them against you. Please don't be shy and share your thoughts in the comments below. What were your experiences with the Bloody Mary legend growing up? What version of the story did you hear? Did you ever try the summoning ritual in the bathroom, or did you just play Truth or Dare and experiment sexually like normal hormonal teenagers? These friggin' geeks with their Ouija boards. Here is your regular reminder that Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and ad-free on Patreon. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when our newest content is uploaded. Good night, be well, until we talk again.
There's just something about Mary.
You wanna get sued?